Today's passage, the book of Amos, chapter 1, verses 2 through 12. Amos 1, 2 through 12. He said, "The Lord roars from Zion, and thunders from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds dry up, the top of Carmel withers. This is what the Lord says. For 3 sins of Damascus, even for 4, I will not turn back my wrath. Because she threshed Gilead with a sledge having iron teeth. I will send fire upon the house of Hazael that will consume the fortresses of Ben-Hadad. I will break down the gates of Damascus. I will destroy the king who is in the valley of Auburn. And the one who holds the scepter of Beth-Eden, the people of Aram, will go into exile to Kir. This is what the Lord says. For 3 sins of Gaza, even for 4, I will not turn back my wrath. Because she took captive whole communities and sold them to Edom. I will send fire upon the walls of Gaza that will consume her fortresses, and I will destroy the king of Ashdod and the one who holds the scepter in Ashkelon. I will turn my hand against Erechon till the last of the Philistines is dead, says the sovereign Lord. This is what the Lord says. For 3 sins of Tyre, even for 4, I will not turn back my wrath. Because she sold whole communities of captives to Edom, disregarding a treaty of brotherhood. I will send fire upon the walls of Tyre that will consume her fortresses. This is what the Lord says. For 3 sins of Edom, even for 4, I will not turn back my wrath. Because he pursued his brother with a sword, stifling all compassion. Because of his anger, raged continually, and his fury flamed unchecked. I will send fire upon Tinman that will consume the fortress of Basra. I blame the Cowardly Lion. I do. I blame the Wizard of Oz, but specifically the Cowardly Lion. I know it's satire. I get that Cowardly Lion is a joke. Lions aren't cowardly, that's the point. They're one of the most fearless animals in the natural world. Rightfully so. But I blame the Cowardly Lion. Because now, I blame the Cowardly Lion for taking away our fear of lions. Nowadays, lions are cute and cuddly or bumbling fools. They're Simba from The Lion King or Prince John from what I maintain is the best version of Robin Hood ever put to film. Lions are easygoing comic relief. And it all goes back to the Cowardly Lion. He started this. Prior to the Cowardly Lion, lions were fearsome. They were rightly regarded as one of the scariest animals in the world. Lions aren't the biggest. Tigers have the distinction of being the largest cat. Lions aren't the fastest. We know that's cheetahs. But lions are the only large cat that hunts in a pack. A pride of lions was one of the most terrifying things that people could imagine. They were rightly understood as dangerous, powerful, and deadly hunters. I think I once told you about a story where I took Paley to the Indianapolis Zoo. And we went to see the lion. And we, with about a dozen other people, were standing there. And at that moment, the lion decided to roar. It is the only time I have ever heard a lion roar in my life. And I've got to tell you, television does not do it justice. We were standing there. There were good, thick steel bars between us and that lion. And when it roared, we all stepped backwards. It's said that a lion's roar can be heard for 7 miles on an open plain, and I believe it. That is a powerful sound. I think the Cowardly Lion has taken away our fear of lions, but a few moments with the real thing rectifies that. I say all this because the book of Amos begins with a roar. God is on the Jerusalem from his temple, and he roars out his warning against the people. powerful sound. Amos was preaching before the exile. This means that the nation of Israel had been divided in half. There was the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. But neither one had been conquered in war yet. Amos came from the southern kingdom of Judah, but he traveled to the northern kingdom of Israel to deliver the word of the Lord. And this word began with a roar. I know there's 3 reasons a lion roars. First, a lion roars to tell the other animals where he is. He's letting his pride, and all other animals know where that lion is. And when God roared out from Jerusalem, he was saying, I am here. He's not a distant God sitting up in heaven looking down at earth in a disinterested way. He is the omnipresent God. He's the God who is here. He's the God who cares about how we live and what happens in our lives. And second, a lion roars to declare his strength. Other than man, there is no animal on earth that would challenge a pride of lions. God roared to declare his strength. There is no one who can challenge him. All the false gods of this world, the most arrogant of people, the strongest of nations, none can stand before the wrath of the Lord. And third, a lion roars as a warning. He's warning other lions to stay away from his pride, and he's warning other animals not to mess with his pride. God roared as a warning. He was warning people the dangers of sin. He was warning people to turn back from evil. Amos gives a roar from God. And the central theme of this passage is justice. I need to pause here for a moment because I found that people get a little confused about the word justice. Justice was one of the most common themes throughout the minor prophets. But often when we hear the word justice, we think of punishment, or maybe even revenge. That's not what justice means, at least not in the biblical sense. In the biblical sense, justice means that we act in a way that is right in dealing with other people. It means that we treat other people fairly and impartially and with integrity. We treat them with justice. Now, often when God spoke of his justice, it was because people had been unjust. So many times God's call to justice included his warning of his judgment. But judgment and justice are not the same thing. God was calling his people to justice, to treat others fairly and impartially, to treat them with justice. And he warns that the people had not been acting in justice. He warns of his judgment, that people had turned away from what is right. He said that both Israel and the nations around her had abandoned justice. Now, God would come to the sins of Israel, and we'll get to that next week. But today I want to focus on what God says about the nations surrounding Israel. These are people who did not know the Lord, so he did not hold them to the same standard of God as God's people, but he also accuses them of turning away from what was good, of acting in sin, and he warns that if they do not return to justice, that he will bring his wrath against them. In this passage, we're told of 4 different nations and 3 sins that these nations had committed. And in each of these statements of justice and judgment, God says, for 3 sins, even for 4, I will not turn back my wrath. I'm saying this, God's not counting off the people's sins. Rather, he is saying that they have fallen into these same sins over and over again. He is giving an example of a pattern of sin that these nations are living in. He calls them to justice. The first sin we see among these nations is that the sin of Damascus. And God says that he will not hold back his wrath against Damascus because they have threshed Gilead with this with a shed of iron teeth. Okay, now we are separated from these events by thousands of years, so to us, that just sounds strange. But in the ancient world, it would have made perfect sense. For a very short time in the ancient Middle East, the city of Damascus, the capital of Syria, rose to power. And the Syrians used their newfound power, position, and authority to abuse their neighbors. Specifically, they attacked, conquered, and destroyed the nation of Gilead. And they did this basically for no other reason than the fact that Gilead was there. Without any provocation, they used their power to destroy a neighboring nation. And this is the first accusation God brings against these people. He says they abused power. I'll give you an illustration here. I asked a few of the teenagers to help me out in this sermon. Would you guys come forward really quickly? Oh, come on, Christian. No? Probably a wise choice. Okay, guys. These three guys are going to help me out really quick. I've got several steps here, so I'm going to take you through one at a time. Ready? So first, we should all turn and face that way. Okay, now I want you to, both hands, grab your ankles. Probably. Go ahead. Can you make a raspberry sound for me? Yeah. No. This is me abusing power. Thank you. Okay, that was obviously silly. At the same time, thank you guys. Told you, Christian, you made the right choice. That was silly. But at the same time, we recognize that the abuse of power is a much more serious thing. Throughout the Old Testament, there are very few things that anger God as much as those who abuse their power. And this can be from the highest levels of kings and presidents and international businessmen. And it can be on a much smaller, more personal level. It can be a teacher who plays favorites in the classroom. It can be a store manager who takes advantage of her employees. It can be it can be the schoolyard bully who steals somebody else's lunch money. Because really, at its heart, that's what the abuse of power is. It is being a bully. From the schoolyard bully to a king commanding his armies, every abuse of power is someone being a bully. And God says that he will not stand for a bully. He will not stand for those who abuse their power. And he says that Damascus had abused power. And so he would tear down the fortresses of Damascus. That he would take away their power because they had abused that power. Until God says he will not stand for those who are a bully, who abuse power. Hope you'll forgive me for a few minutes ago. So this is the first sin of the nations around Israel. They abused power. This brings us into the second sin of the nations around Israel. And this is a sin for both Gaza and Tyre. God says that he will not hold back his wrath against these nations because they captured entire communities and sold them into slavery. Okay, this gets a little complicated. I've often heard people attack the Bible because they say that the Bible allows for slavery. And that is true, sort of. It's also been said that America's original sin is slavery. And I also think that is true. That as a nation, we had for a long time slavery based on racial prejudice in which people were captured and forced into slavery. And that goes against everything in the Bible from front to back. In the Old Testament, there was a kind of slavery that existed. It was a financial institution. a person could sell themselves as a slave. Usually they did that because of immense debt. However, no one was allowed to force another person into slavery. It had to be that person's own choice. According to the book of Exodus, to capture a person and to make them a slave was a crime punishable by death. To purchase a slave who had been forced into slavery also carried with it the death penalty. And this is what the nations of Gaza and Tyre had done. They captured entire communities and sold them as slaves. And God said that he would not stand for this, that he would make these nations defenseless, tearing down their power because they had made other people defenseless. Okay, how do we apply this in our lives today? Now, first, I think we have to apply it literally. Let me say right off, this is one of those things I really feel I shouldn't have to say. Honestly, I feel weird needing to say what I'm about to say, but I guess it's the world we live in, and it's got to be said. Slavery is a thing in America again. That terrifies me. We call it human trafficking. That is a misleading term. When we hear the word trafficking, we think of moving someone to one place to another. That's not what human trafficking is. Human trafficking is kidnapping, enslaving, and selling another human being. To give you an idea of how bad this has become, the federal government has set up a hotline to report instances of human trafficking. That hotline receives 150 calls every day of human trafficking in America. Throughout my life, I have heard people say that God's judgment will come for this or that reason. I tend to avoid that phrase as much as possible. But here I will say, this will bring God's judgment. If we as a nation allow this kind of slavery to exist and to continue, we are inviting God's judgment against us. Now, a challenge in saying this is that I think it's safe to assume that no one in this room right now has any first-hand knowledge of this. We're not dealing with this personally. To even know about it and to do nothing would be to invite God's judgment against us. But I think it's safe to say this is not something we are dealing with. So how do we make this something that applies to our lives? Well, if I could take this in a more general sense, slavery is treating another person like a thing. And we don't have to have literal slavery to do that. We treat another person like a thing when we think mainly about what we can get out of it. We treat another person like a thing when we treat them as something to be used. And this is something that we can fall into. An employer whose only goal is to get as much work out of employees for as little money as possible, without concern for their well-being, is treating people like things. A spouse who sees their husband or their wife as someone mainly there to do the dishes and take care of the kids is treating their spouse as a thing. A friend who views their friend only as someone to vent to is treating a friend like a thing. Now, I'm not saying we should never vent to our friends. We all need to vent sometimes. I'm not even saying that we shouldn't rely on our spouse for help around the home, or that an employer shouldn't want the best from their employees. At the same time, it is scary how easy it is for us to fall into a habit of treating people like things. Treating them not as individuals with their own hopes and dreams and fears and successes and failures, but treating them just as a thing to be used. God warns us against treating people like things. And this leads right into the third sin that God warned the nations about. He said that he would not withhold his wrath from the nation of Edom, because they had pursued their brothers with the sword and stifled all compassion. I think of all these, this is the most straightforward sin mentioned. The people lacked compassion. And I've talked about compassion several times in the past, but I think it's a topic worth returning to. Compassion means that when we see someone in need, we try to help them. The backstory for Edom is that they lacked compassion. Excuse me. A city in Israel had been conquered in war, and the people had been forced to flee as refugees, leaving everything behind. And the people of Eden had an opportunity to help these refugees. Instead, they blocked the roads, making travel even more dangerous. And they had an opportunity to show compassion to people who had lost everything, and instead they made their lives more difficult. God said he would not withstand that kind of a lack of compassion. And it's worth noting that throughout the New Testament, throughout the four Gospels, we're only told of one instance when Jesus became angry. When I say that, people often think I'm talking about Jesus cleansing the temple, where he went in, man, I'm losing my voice here. When he went in and he knocked over the money changers' tables and he fashioned a whip to drive out the animals. That's not it. That's not what I'm talking about. For Jesus, that was a visual aid. There's no mention of anger anywhere in that passage. The only time we are told that Jesus became angry was when, in Mark chapter 3, a man with a withered hand came up to Jesus on the Sabbath to be healed. And many of the Pharisees were watching him, wondering if he would heal on the Sabbath. Jesus had the man stand up in front of everyone. And he said, which is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? And everybody in the room went, hope he doesn't call on me. That is the only time in the Gospels where we're told Jesus became angry. That lack of compassion was the one thing that got him mad. Personally, I think the greatest story of compassion ever recorded is the parable of the Good Samaritan. A man from Jerusalem was attacked, beaten, and left for dead. A Levite and a priest, the good church people, passed him by without helping. A Samaritan, his enemy, saw him, rushed to him, treated his wounds, and took him to a place where he could recover and made sure he was safe. That is compassion. Compassion does not ask, does this person deserve my help? Compassion does not ask, would this person help me if our positions were reversed? Compassion does not ask, what will I get out of helping this person? Compassion sees someone else in need and helps just because they are in need. The nations around Israel had failed in compassion. They had abused power and they had treated people like things. God said he would not hold back his wrath because of this. Today we have redemption. God has poured out his wrath on Jesus Christ. The one man in all history who was without sin became a sin offering for us. We have redemption in that. Jesus has died for us. He has risen from the dead. He has taken away all of our sin. Let's not use that as an excuse for sin. Let's not treat God's love like cheap grace. The Christian theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, cheap grace is preaching forgiveness without requiring repentance, baptism without church discipline, communion without confession, absolution without personal confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without a cross, grace without Jesus Christ living and incarnate. God's grace, God's redemption is unimaginable, unspeakable, and unmerited. It is not cheap. Let us live in a way that we are living up to what we have already received. In a moment, we're going to stand for an invitation hymn. And if you have turned away from what is good and right, if you have been relying on cheap grace, If you have been living in sin and you need a redeeming Father, if you need the blood of Christ to cover your sin, you have an opportunity. I ask you to stand with me now for invitation hymn, which is Pass Me Not, number 337, and we'll sing just the first verse.